My name is Major Edmund Lotz, retired from Her Majesty's service with a leg that never properly forgave the Crimea for what it asked of it, and I had been taking the waters at Thornwell Wells every autumn for 11 years by 1889, on my physician's insistence that the mineral springs did my old injuries more good than any modern treatment yet devised. It was in the pump room of that spa, on a wet October afternoon, that I witnessed a wager made in careless cruelty resolve itself into one of the finest things I have seen in a long and reasonably eventful life. Thornwell Wells was, in those years, a fashionable if faded sort of place, past its grandest Georgian heyday, but still drawing a steady custom of invalids, dowagers, and idle young persons of means, who found the taking of mineral waters a convenient excuse for a season away from London. The pump room itself was a handsome hall of tall windows and a colonnade of slender pillars, at the center of which stood the pump from which the famous waters were dispensed by a rotating staff of young attendants, and along one wall, somewhat incongruously, a fine grand piano, donated some years before by a grateful patient whose gout the waters had reportedly cured. Grace Tillman was 21 that autumn, and had served at the pump for some 3 years, dispensing the mineral waters to whichever gouty colonel or delicate spinster required their morning glass, with a quiet, unremarkable competence that I do not think any of us regular visitors had ever thought to look beyond. I certainly had not, in 3 years of taking my own morning glass from her hand, ever had occasion to wonder what she did with her evenings, or what her people had been before whatever circumstance brought her to service at a spa pump. I learned only afterward, from the spa's long-serving director, a Mr. Halloway, who had known the family slightly, that Grace's mother had been a concert pianist of some modest reputation in her youth, not a famous name, but a genuinely accomplished one, trained properly at a London academy, before she had married, against her own family's considerable objections, a country solicitor's clerk of no fortune whatsoever, and been disowned for it in the thorough, permanent manner Victorian families reserved for daughters who married beneath their station. The mother had died when Grace was 16, leaving behind, along with very little money, a lifetime's careful instruction in piano technique that she had passed to her only daughter in the years before her death, on whatever instrument the family could find room for in their modest cottage. Grace had gone into service at the spa 2 years after her mother's death, her father having followed his wife to the grave not long after in what I am told was as much grief as illness, and had simply never mentioned, to any of her employers or the guests she served, that she could play a note. I had, in the ordinary run of things, taken little enough notice of the spa's various attendants, beyond the courtesy any gentleman extends to those who serve him, and I confess, this failure of attention troubled me rather more, in later reflection, than it might have done a younger or less idle man. I had, after all, 11 years' worth of mornings in which I might have asked Grace Tillman a single question about herself beyond the state of the weather, and had never once thought to do so, which is precisely the sort of comfortable blindness a long convalescence teaches a man to indulge in, without ever quite noticing he is indulging in it. It was the Honorable Rupert Ashcombe who set the afternoon's unfortunate events in motion, a young man of considerable fortune and considerably less occupation, down from London for the season on some vague pretext of his physician's recommending a change of air, though I always suspected the true motive was an unpaid gambling debt his father wished him to forget in quieter surroundings for a month or two. He was not, I want to be clear, a young man of any real cruelty in his ordinary dealings, merely bored, thoroughly bored, in the particular way of young men with more money than purpose, and disposed that October afternoon to relieve his boredom at someone else's expense. The pump room's resident organist, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Faversham, who normally provided a little gentle music during the afternoon hours to soothe the invalids, had been taken unexpectedly ill that week, leaving the piano silent and the afternoon's atmosphere, in young Mr. Ashcombe's stated opinion, deadly dull, worse than a dentist's waiting room. He had been amusing himself and a small circle of similarly idle young companions by making increasingly extravagant wagers about trivial matters. Whether it would rain before 4 o'clock, whether old Colonel Pemberton would take his second glass before or after his newspaper, when his eye fell on Grace Tillman crossing the room with a tray of empty glasses, and he conceived, I suppose, that a new form of amusement had presented itself. "I'll wager £50 to the spa's benevolent fund," he announced, loudly enough that a good portion of the pump room turned to listen. "That our pump girl here can produce something rather more entertaining than mineral water, if given the chance. What do you say, my girl? Can you play that thing gathering dust in the corner? Or is pouring water the whole of your accomplishment?" There was a scattering of uncomfortable laughter from his companions, and I saw several of the older guests, myself included, exchange the particular glance people share when a young fool has said something considerably crueler than he seems to have noticed. Grace Tillman set down her tray with perfect composure and regarded young Mr. Ashcombe for a moment before answering. "I can play a little, sir," she said, "though I don't know that £50 ought to hang on it." "£50 to the benevolent fund if you play something worth hearing," Ashcombe said, warming now to an audience. "And not 1 farthing if you can't, though I confess I expect to keep my money, and no shame to you for it. Pump attendants aren't generally trained at the academy, I think." "No, sir," Grace said. "Only their mothers were, sometimes." There was a brief silence at that, the particular silence of a room uncertain whether it has just witnessed a servant's impertinence or something else entirely, and I saw Mrs. Fanshawe Curry's eyebrows rise a full half-inch, though whether in disapproval of Grace or of Ashcombe, I could not, at the time, have said with any confidence. Ashcombe himself laughed, a short, uneasy sound that did not quite carry the conviction his earlier bravado had managed, as though some small part of him had already begun to suspect he had wandered further into the exchange than his original idle amusement had intended. I do not think Ashcombe understood, in that moment, what she meant by it, and I am not certain the room did either, though Mr. Halloway, standing near the door, told me afterward that he had gone rather still at the remark, being one of the few people present who knew the family history. Grace crossed to the piano, drew off the plain gray gloves she wore for her pump duties, and sat at the bench with a composure that struck me, even before she had played a single note, as considerably more settled than the situation strictly warranted. I learned afterward, from Mr. Halloway, a good deal more of what those intervening years had cost Grace Tillman, and what quiet discipline they had also required of her. She had continued her mother's teaching entirely alone after the woman's death, working through the small collection of scores her mother had left behind, some inherited from her own brief academy years, others copied out by hand in the evenings when new sheet music could not be afforded, on a cottage piano her father had kept, against all financial sense, rather than sell it after his wife's death, on the theory, he told his daughter once, that some debts to the dead are better paid in kept promises than in ready money. Grace practiced most evenings after her pump duties ended, in the hour before the light failed and the cottage's single lamp had to be lit, and had never once, in 3 years of service at Thornwell Wells, mentioned this evening discipline to a single soul among her employers, on the reasoning, she told Mr. Halloway long afterward, that a pump attendant who spoke of concert repertoire invited exactly the kind of mockery Ashcombe had just delivered, and she had seen no profit in inviting it early. She began Chopin's Andante spianato et grande polonaise brillante. I will confess I did not at first know the piece by name. Mr. Halloway supplied it to me afterward, along with a great many other details I did not myself observe firsthand. But I did not need to know its name to understand, within the first several bars of that gentle, flowing Andante, that we were not hearing a pump attendant's modest parlor accomplishment. The opening is deceptively simple, a lyrical, almost nocturne-like melody that could, I suppose, have passed for the sort of little tune young Ashcombe had mockingly invited, and I saw his own expression settle into something smugly satisfied during those first tranquil pages, as though the wager were already comfortably won. Then the Polonaise began. The transformation was, even to my untrained ear, immediate and considerable. The music gathering itself from that gentle opening into a brilliant, technically formidable display of the kind I associated with the concert programs my late wife used to drag me to in London, full of rapid octave passages and cascading ornament that seemed entirely beyond the reach of a young woman who spent her mornings pouring mineral water into other people's glasses. I watched young Ashcombe's satisfied smirk falter within, perhaps 30 seconds of the Polonaise's opening flourish, and I watched it continue to falter, by degrees, through each successive page of bravura difficulty that Grace Tillman dispatched with a controlled, glittering assurance that left absolutely no doubt to anyone in that room with ears to hear it, that 50 pounds had been a considerable underestimate of what was being demonstrated. Colonel Pemberton, seated near me with his second glass of the waters entirely forgotten at his elbow, muttered something under his breath that I did not quite catch but took, from his expression, to be roughly equivalent to my own sentiments. Mrs. Fanshawe Curry, a formidable dowager who had, until that afternoon, addressed perhaps 4 words to Grace Tillman in as many years of morning visits, had risen halfway from her chair and appeared to have forgotten she was in the process of standing. I noticed, too, several of the younger attendants who had gathered near the doorway to watch, their own trays momentarily abandoned, exchanging looks I can only describe as a kind of collective, delighted disbelief, the particular expression of people watching one of their own quietly upend a room's whole understanding of who deserved its attention. The Grande Polonaise built, through its succession of increasingly demanding variations, toward a final page of such glittering technical display that I saw even young Ashcombe's companions, who had come to the pump room that afternoon for nothing more than an idle wager and some gentle sport at a servant's expense, go entirely quiet, their earlier amusement replaced by the particular attentiveness of people watching something considerably beyond what they had bargained for. When the final chord rang out across that colonnaded hall, there was a silence of perhaps 3 full seconds. I counted them. I do not know why. Some instinct of an old soldier used to marking time in moments that mattered, before the entire pump room broke into applause. There is a brief passage near the Polonaise's close where the melody rises through a series of brilliant octave leaps before settling into its final triumphant statement, and I recall watching Grace's hands cover that considerable distance with a precision that seemed, even to my untrained eye, to belong to years of disciplined practice rather than a single lucky afternoon. And I thought, watching it, of all those evening hours in a cottage with a single lamp that none of us in that comfortable pump room had ever troubled to imagine for her. Young Ashcombe did not join the applause immediately. I watched him instead sit very still in his chair, the particular stillness of a man recalculating, rapidly and unhappily, the true size of what his idle boredom had just cost him. Not the 50 pounds, which his family's fortune could absorb without the least difficulty, but something considerably harder to recover, which was the good opinion of a room full of people who had just watched him make a public fool of himself at the expense of a young woman he had badly misjudged. He rose, eventually, and crossed to the piano, and I will say this in his favor. Whatever his faults, he did not attempt to brazen out the moment or make light of it. "I owe you a good deal more than 50 pounds, I think," he said, "and a considerably larger apology than I know how to make properly in front of a room. I spoke to you as though pouring water were the whole of what a person could be, and I find I was a fool to think it, and a crueler fool to say it aloud. The 50 pounds will do the benevolent fund a great deal of good, sir," Grace said, "whatever else you think you owe." "You'll have both," Ashcombe said, "and I should like to know, if you'll permit the question, where you learned to play a piece I could not name if my life depended on it." "My mother taught me," Grace said. "She played rather better than I do, before her own people put an end to that, on account of the man she chose to marry instead. I've had no teacher since she died, only what she managed to give me before, and whatever I've worked out for myself in the evenings since." I do not know precisely what passed through young Ashcombe's mind in the silence that followed, but I can tell you what he did in the weeks afterward, because Mr. Halloway kept me informed of the whole business, with the particular relish of a man who enjoys seeing a good story reach its proper conclusion. Ashcombe made good on his 50 pounds to the benevolent fund within the week, and then, rather to everyone's surprise, arranged and funded, through his London solicitors, a scholarship for Grace Tillman's return to formal musical training at the very academy her mother had once attended, along with a standing arrangement that she should give a short recital in the pump room each Thursday afternoon for as long as she cared to remain in Thornwell's employ, at a proper musician's fee rather than a pump attendant's wages. Grace Tillman left the spa's service the following spring for London and her mother's old academy, and I am told she has since built a modest but genuine concert career of her own, playing, on occasion, in halls rather grander than a spa town's pump room, though I understand she has never declined an invitation to return to Thornwell Wells each autumn to give a single recital for the benevolent fund that first £50 wager established, now grown, through years of steady giving, into a fund that has paid for a good deal more than one young woman's music lessons. I had occasion, some years afterward, to attend one of those autumn recitals myself. By then, a rather older man, leaning more heavily on his cane than he had in 1889, and I confess, I found it a considerably more moving occasion than I had anticipated when Mr. Halloway first mentioned the tradition to me. Grace Tillman, by then a woman approaching 30 with a genuine reputation of her own, played the same andante spianato et grande polonaise brillante to close her program, and told the assembled guests, before she began, that she played it every year at Thornwell for the same reason a person revisits any place where their life quietly changed its course, which was simply to remember, properly, how very nearly it might not have. Mr. Halloway told me, some years later, that young Ashcombe had written to him privately from London, some months after the events of that October, to ask whether the benevolent fund might make use of a further, considerably larger sum, on the condition that his name be kept entirely out of the matter, a condition Mr. Halloway respected faithfully for as long as Ashcombe lived, and which I am breaking now, only because I understand the gentleman has been dead these several years, and can no longer object to the credit. I have always thought that quiet second gift said rather more about the true measure of the man than his careless remark in the pump room ever did, and I have tried, in the years since, to extend other idle young men the same patience I eventually learned to extend him. I have taken the waters at Thornwell Wells every autumn since, 11 years before that October afternoon, and a good many years after it, and I have heard a great many pleasant afternoon performances in that pump room in all that time. I have never heard anything to match the particular quality of that first one, when a bored young man's careless wager, meant to embarrass a servant for an idle afternoon's entertainment, instead taught an entire room of comfortable people the considerable folly of assuming they already knew the whole of what any person pouring their morning glass of water might, given half a chance, turn out to be.